The lawyer set down the folder, looked at my brother first, then at me, and said the sentence that would split my family down a seam that had been pulling loose for 31 years. Eleanor's instructions were specific. The orchard, the bakery, and the house on Linden Road go to Margaret's daughter, not to the biological grandchild, to the one she chose. Daniel laughed before he understood it wasn't a joke. My mother's hand found the edge of the table like she needed it to stay upright. And I sat there in my grandmother's lawyer's office, in the chair she used to tell me was the thinking chair, and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. Because for 31 years, I had been waiting for someone in this family to say, out loud, in a room with witnesses, that I belonged to it just as much as anyone born into it. My name is Marin Calloway. This is the story of how my grandmother spent the last good years of her life building a case for me without ever once telling me she was doing it, and how the rest of my family spent those same years building a different kind of case, one written in forged signatures and quiet cruelty that nearly buried both of us. I was 3 years old when Thomas and Margaret Calloway adopted me out of a county foster placement in central Ohio. I don't remember the placement. I don't remember a before. My first real memory, the one I can still feel in my body when I close my eyes, is of my mother's kitchen copper pots hanging from a rack, flour dust caught in a slant of afternoon light, and Eleanor Calloway, my grandmother, kneeling down to my height and saying, "There you are. We've been waiting for you." Not welcome, not we're so happy to have you. We've been waiting for you, like I was already expected, like the family had a chair with my name on it and they'd simply been holding the seat. Margaret and Thomas had tried for 9 years to have a biological child before they adopted me. 3 miscarriages, 2 failed rounds of treatment they couldn't really afford, a marriage that had nearly buckled under the grief of it. When the adoption agency called about a toddler who needed placement quickly, my mother has told me, in the rare moments she let her guard down enough to tell me anything real, that she cried in the parking lot of the agency before she'd even seen my face, because some exhausted, hopeful part of her already knew. For the first 5 years of my life, I was an only child, and by every account I've pieced together since, a happy one. There are photographs, birthday cakes with my name spelled in shaky icing, a school recital where my father stood on a folding chair to film me, nearly fell, and laughed about it for years afterward. I was Marin Calloway, full stop. Nobody in those photographs looks like they're holding their breath. Then, when I was 8, my mother got pregnant. It wasn't supposed to happen. The doctors had told her after the miscarriages that another pregnancy was unlikely, and a successful one even less so. So when Daniel arrived, healthy, loud, undeniably theirs by blood, my parents treated it the way most people would treat an honest miracle. They were stunned. They were grateful. And without anyone deciding to do it on purpose, the temperature of our house changed by exactly 1 degree, in a direction that took years to notice. I don't think my parents loved Daniel more than me. I want to say that clearly, because this isn't a story about villains, and my mother in particular spent decades trying, in her limited and sometimes clumsy way, to love us both the same. But there is a difference between being loved and being treated as proof of something. Daniel didn't have to prove he belonged to the Calloway family. He arrived already proven, in the shape of my father's jaw and my mother's eyes. I had spent 5 years building my belonging out of birthdays and bedtime stories, and being the only kid in the house. And then I watched, at 8 years old, as belonging became a thing some people simply had and other people had to keep demonstrating. It showed up in small ways first. An aunt at Thanksgiving cooing over how much Daniel looked like a true Calloway. A family friend asking my mother in front of me if she'd ever consider having one of her own, as if I were a rental, a placeholder, something other than her own. My mother always corrected people. She was good at that, fierce even. But I noticed that she corrected them after the comment had already landed in the room, after I'd already heard it, after the moment when the correction could have stopped it from touching me had passed. My grandmother, Eleanor, never made that mistake. Eleanor Calloway was my father's mother, a widow by the time I came into the family, and the proprietor of a bakery on Linden Road that she had built with her own hands and her late husband's small life insurance payout back in the 1970s. Behind the bakery sat 4 acres of apple orchard that had been there since before the building, planted by the previous owner and kept alive, against considerable odds and Ohio winters, by Eleanor's stubbornness alone. She was not a soft woman. I want to be honest about that, because the version of grandmothers in most of these stories is gentle and doting, and Eleanor was neither of those things by nature. She was sharp-tongued, impatient with self-pity, and had opinions about pie crust that she defended like doctrine. But she had a particular gift, one I didn't understand the value of until I was much older. She looked at people and saw what was actually there, not what she'd been told to expect. From the day I arrived in the family, Eleanor treated me exactly the way she treated Daniel when he came along 5 years later, which is to say, with the same blunt, undecorated attention. She didn't introduce me to people as Thomas and Margaret's adopted daughter. She introduced me as my granddaughter, Marin, who's going to take over the lemon scones one day. God help us all. When I was 9, a year after Daniel was born, Eleanor started bringing me to the bakery on Saturday mornings. Just me. She said it was because I was old enough to be useful and Daniel was still in diapers, which was true. But it was also the beginning of something neither of us named at the time. She taught me to fold dough the way her own mother had taught her, hands dusted white, both of us quiet in that particular way bakers are quiet, focused, unhurried, content. "You've got patient hands," she told me once, examining a croissant I'd shaped badly but carefully. "That's rarer than people think. Most folks want to rush to the part where the thing is finished. You're willing to sit in the part where it's still becoming something." I didn't know, at 9, that she was describing more than pastry. The orchard became mine in a different way, not legally, not yet, but in the way a place becomes yours when you're the one who shows up to it. While Daniel grew into a child who preferred screens and structured activities, I spent my afternoons among Eleanor's apple trees, learning which branches needed thinning, which trees were stubborn, and which were generous, how to tell from the smell of the soil whether the irrigation lines needed checking. Eleanor walked those rows with me for hours, not always talking, sometimes just present, the way people are present with each other when the relationship has stopped needing performance. "Your brother doesn't care for this place," she said once, when I was maybe 12, watching Daniel sulk in the car because he'd been dragged along and wanted to go home. "And that's fine. Not everyone has to. But you," she turned and looked at me very directly, the way she did when she meant something to land, "you understand it. That's not nothing, Marin. That's not nothing at all." I held on to that sentence for years, without fully knowing why. What I didn't see yet, what I wouldn't understand until I was an adult sitting in a lawyer's office, was that Eleanor wasn't just teaching her granddaughter to bake. She was quietly, deliberately, over the course of a decade, building a record, a paper trail of presence, of competence, of relationship, that would matter enormously later, in ways neither of us could have predicted, and that she, I now believe, absolutely intended. I need to be fair to my brother, because it would be easy, in a story like this, to make him into a simple villain, and Daniel was never simple and never, in his own mind, a villain. Daniel grew up knowing 2 things with total certainty, that he was loved, and that he was the real Calloway, the bloodline, the continuation, the one the family tree would eventually point to when people asked where the Calloways came from. Nobody sat him down and explicitly taught him this. It was absorbed, the way children absorb everything. From comments at holidays and the particular pride in our father's voice when he talked about Daniel, carrying on the name, and the casual, repeated assumption, never malicious, always thoughtless, that certain things in the family were naturally his. The bakery and the orchard were one of those things. By the time Daniel was 16, our parents had started referring to Linden Road, informally, as Daniel's someday. Not because Eleanor had said anything of the sort, she hadn't, not once, not to anyone, but because it fit the story the family already believed about itself. The biological son inherits the family business. That's just how it works. Nobody questioned it because nobody had to. It confirmed something they already assumed was true. I want to be honest. For years, I assumed it too. I loved the orchard, I loved my grandmother, but I had grown up in a house where I'd learned, gently and repeatedly, that certain rooms in this family's future simply weren't mine to occupy. So when I pictured Linden Road in 20 years, I pictured visiting it, Daniel's. Eventually, with me as a welcome guest, the way you're welcome in a house that was never going to have your name on the deed. It was Eleanor who first complicated that picture, and she did it without ever saying a single word about inheritance. I was 23, newly graduated, deciding what to do with a business degree I wasn't sure I wanted, when Eleanor asked me to come run the bakery's books for a summer, just to see. Daniel, 28 by then, had shown zero interest in the business beyond assuming he'd own it eventually. He was working in sales in Columbus and visited Linden Road maybe 4 times a year, always briefly, always slightly impatient to leave. That summer turned into 18 months. I rebuilt the bakery's ordering system, modernized the books that Eleanor had kept by hand since 1981, and spent every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in the orchard with her, the two of us slower now, her knees worse, my questions sharper. She started teaching me things she'd never taught anyone. Which supplier had quietly raised prices 3 years running, which trees to graft, and when the actual margins on the seasonal pies that everyone assumed were the bakery's biggest earners and weren't. "You ask the right questions," she told me one October afternoon, sitting on the bench at the edge of row 6, watching me note something in a ledger. "Daniel never asks questions about this place. He asks questions about when it'll be his." I remember laughing it off, uncomfortable, the way you laugh off something that feels too close to a truth you've been avoiding. "He's just busy, Grandma." She didn't laugh. She looked at the orchard for a long moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether to say something out loud or let it sit a while longer. "Busy isn't the same as caring, Marin," she said. "I've watched you not need to be asked twice about anything that matters to this place since you were 9 years old. I've watched your brother ask, every single year, what this place is worth." She didn't say anything else that day, but it was the first time I understood that my grandmother had been keeping score, not out of cruelty, not to punish Daniel for who he was, but because she believed, with the same stubbornness she'd brought to keeping an orchard alive through Ohio winters, that legacy should follow care, not just blood. And she had spent over a decade quietly documenting exactly who had shown up. Eleanor's health started declining the winter I turned 26. Nothing dramatic at first. A slower walk through the orchard rows, a tremor in her left hand that made piping icing difficult, longer afternoons resting in the chair by the bakery's front window instead of working the floor. She fought every accommodation we tried to make for her with the same stubbornness she'd brought to everything else in her life. But eventually, even Eleanor couldn't out-argue her own body. It was around this time that my parents, Thomas and Margaret, started visiting Linden Road more often than they had in years. I want to describe this carefully, because at the time I read it as simple concern, and it took me a long while afterward to recognize it as something else. My mother, in particular, began having long, closed-door conversations with Eleanor that she described to me afterward as just catching up or talking about her health. My father started asking me, casually, almost in passing, whether Eleanor had mentioned anything about plans for the bakery, a question I answered honestly, because I genuinely didn't know. Eleanor had never discussed her will with me, not once. I assumed, the same way I'd assumed for years, that whatever she decided was simply not something I had a right to ask about. Daniel started visiting more too, which surprised me, until I understood why. He'd recently lost his sales job in Columbus, was carrying debt I didn't know the size of at the time, and had, by his own later admission, started thinking very seriously, very specifically, about what the bakery and the 4 acres behind it might be worth on paper. He brought up the future of the place at a family dinner that spring with a confidence that made it sound less like a hope and more like a plan already half-formed in his head. "Once it's mine," he said, describing some renovation idea for the bakery's storefront, "I'm thinking we modernize the whole front, maybe even sell off part of the orchard for development that land's worth more as lots than as apple trees at this point." I remember the silence that followed. I remember looking at my mother, who didn't correct him. I remember the particular ache of realizing that my brother had already, in his own mind, subdivided and sold a piece of land he didn't yet own, land where I had spent more Saturdays than anywhere else in my life, and that no one at the table seemed to think this was strange. I said something, I don't remember exactly what, defending the orchard the way you'd defend a person. Daniel laughed it off, It's not actually yours to get sentimental about, Mar. Not cruelly. I think, just carelessly, the casual cruelty of someone who has never once doubted his own claim to something. My mother, later that night in the kitchen, told me gently that I needed to manage my expectations about Linden Road. It's not that Grandma doesn't love you, she said, choosing each word like she'd practiced it. It's just, there are certain things that tend to go to blood family. That's not a judgment on you, sweetheart. That's just how these things usually work. I didn't argue with her. I'd had this exact conversation in one form or another my entire life, and I had learned a long time ago that arguing rarely changed the conclusion, only the length of the discomfort before it. What I didn't tell my mother, what I barely let myself think, was that 2 weeks earlier, Eleanor had asked me, out of nowhere, to drive her to an appointment she described only as paperwork, and asked me to wait in the car. When she came back out, she'd been quiet, thoughtful, holding a manila envelope against her chest the entire ride home like it was something fragile. "Everything okay, Grandma?" I'd asked. She'd looked out the window at the passing fields for a long moment before answering. "Everything's exactly how it should be," she said. "Finally." I didn't know, that afternoon, that I was driving my grandmother home from the appointment that would later split my family in half. I didn't know that the envelope on her lap contained a document that would be contested, accused of forgery by the people who least expected its contents, and ultimately become the single piece of paper that decided who I really was to this family, not by blood, but by every Saturday morning I'd shown up. Eleanor declined faster than any of us were ready for. By that autumn, the tremor in her hand had spread to a general unsteadiness that kept her out of the bakery kitchen entirely, and by December, she was spending most days in the back room she'd converted into a sitting area years earlier, wrapped in the same wool blanket she'd had since I was a child, watching the orchard through the window instead of walking it. I came every day after work. Not because anyone asked me to, my parents visited too, dutifully, on a schedule, but because the idea of Eleanor sitting in that room without someone who actually wanted to be there felt unbearable to me. We didn't talk about anything important, most days. We talked about the weather, about a customer who'd complained about the new espresso machine, about whether the trees in row 6 needed pruning before the frost. Ordinary conversation, the kind you don't realize you're memorizing until much later. It was on one of those ordinary afternoons, in early January, that she tried to tell me something and didn't get to finish. "Marin," she said, setting down her tea with more care than usual, "there's something I need you to understand about the appointment we took back in." She stopped, not because she changed her mind, I understood later, but because her body simply stopped letting her continue. The stroke happened mid-sentence, in that chair, with me sitting 3 feet away holding a cup of tea I never got to give her. I called the ambulance. I rode with her. I sat in a hospital hallway for 6 hours not knowing whether the woman who had taught me to fold dough and read an orchard soil would ever finish a sentence again. She survived, but something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in the structure of her speech and the steadiness of her hands. The doctors called it a moderate recovery, all things considered. Eleanor called it, in the dry voice she kept even through rehabilitation, good enough to argue with people, which is really all I needed. My parents used the hospitalization as the opening they'd apparently been waiting for. Within 2 weeks of Eleanor returning home, my mother began arranging what she called helping with the paperwork. Insurance forms, medical directives, things that needed sorting in the wake of a health scare, all reasonable on their face. My father started visiting Linden Road with manila folders of his own, having quiet conversations with Eleanor in the back room that ended whenever I walked in. When I asked, gently, what they were working on, my mother said only, "Just making sure things are in order, sweetheart. You don't need to worry about it." I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for what comes later. I didn't think, at the time, that my parents were doing anything malicious. I genuinely believed they were managing the practical anxieties that come with an aging, ailing parent. It was only afterward, piecing together dates and documents with a lawyer's help, that I understood what those folders actually contained and how close they came to working. If you've ever had a family member try to help You write out of something that mattered to you. I want to hear about it in the comments." I read every single one. The forged signature, when it was finally exposed, traced back to a single Tuesday afternoon in February, 3 days after Eleanor's stroke, while she was still hospitalized, and on a sedation schedule that, according to the medical records later subpoenaed, made sustained, lucid decision-making essentially impossible for most of that day. That was the day a power of attorney document was notarized, granting my father broad authority over Eleanor's financial affairs, including, buried in paragraph 4, in language dense enough to discourage casual reading, the right to manage, encumber, or transfer real property held in the principal's name, including but not limited to the property located at Linden Road. The notary who stamped it was a longtime acquaintance of my father's from the Rotary Club, a man who later told investigators, with what I choose to believe was genuine regret, that he'd been told Eleanor was having a lucid morning and hadn't independently verified her condition before witnessing what he believed was her signature. It wasn't her signature. Not really. Eleanor's actual handwriting, even weakened by age, had a particular slant to the capital E that had been consistent across 40 years of recipe cards and ledgers. The signature on the power of attorney was close enough to pass a glance, but a forensic document examiner, brought in much later by Eleanor's own attorney, would testify that the pressure points and stroke order were inconsistent with Eleanor's known signature and consistent, instead with someone tracing it from a template, likely an old, canceled check. I don't know to this day whether my father held the pen himself, or whether someone else did and he simply allowed it to happen and didn't ask questions. He has never told me, and at a certain point, I stopped needing the answer as much as I'd once thought I would. What I do know is that the document sat quietly, recorded but unused, for the better part of a year. A contingency, I think, rather than an immediate plan. My father didn't try to sell anything or transfer anything while Eleanor was alive. I believe, and I say this without trying to excuse him, that some part of him intended it only as insurance, a fallback in case Eleanor's will didn't go the way the family expected. He was waiting, the way Daniel was waiting, for the inheritance everyone had always assumed was coming. What none of them knew was that Eleanor, recovering in that same hospital, had quietly asked her longtime attorney, not the notary from the Rotary Club, but Walter Pham, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years, to come see her privately twice in the weeks following her stroke. It was Walter who had driven her home that day the previous spring with the manila envelope she'd held against her chest like something fragile. It was Walter she called, lucid and furious, the moment she discovered, through a slip my mother made, mentioning the paperwork your father handled, that something had been signed in her name during the days she could barely remember. She didn't yell, Walter told me much later, the only time he ever described that meeting to me in any detail. Eleanor wasn't a yeller. She just said very calmly, "We're fixing this, and then we're finishing what I started." And then she asked me to bring the documents from the previous spring back out, and we went through every line of them again, out loud, with a witness present and a doctor signing off on her competency right there in the room. She wanted no one to be able to say, ever again, that she didn't know exactly what she was doing. That spring appointment, the one I'd driven her to, the manila envelope on her lap, had been the creation of a trust. A real one, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized, while Eleanor was unambiguously, legally, medically competent. It named me as the eventual owner of the bakery and the 4 acres behind it, with a clause Walter added at her specific request, that the property be held by the granddaughter who has demonstrated sustained care and stewardship of it, regardless of biological relation to the grantor. She had built her case a full year before anyone tried to undermine it. Eleanor died in June, 14 months after her stroke, in her sleep in the house on Linden Road, with my mother and me both present. A detail I hold on to, even now, because whatever came after, my mother loved her too in her own complicated way, and that grief was real and unperformed. The will reading happened 3 weeks later, in Walter Pham's office, with my parents, Daniel, and me all seated around a table that felt smaller than it should have for the size of what was about to happen in it. This is the moment I described at the very start of this story, the moment Walter set down the folder and told my brother, gently but without hesitation, that Eleanor's instructions were specific, that the property went to Margaret's daughter, not to the biological grandchild, that she had chosen, deliberately, in a properly executed trust signed long before any hospital, any sedation, any forged signature, to leave Linden Road to me. What I hadn't known, sitting in that room, was that Walter had already discovered the power of attorney filing weeks earlier, while settling Eleanor's estate. He had cross-referenced its execution date against her hospital records, a step he later told me he took routinely, almost as a formality, never expecting to find anything, and had seen immediately that the dates didn't add up. Eleanor had been under heavy sedation on the afternoon that document claimed. She'd lucidly authorized her son to manage and potentially transfer her property. So when my father, recovering from the shock of the trust's contents, reached for his folder and said, with a calm I now recognize as rehearsed, "Actually, there's a power of attorney that supersedes any of this, that gives me authority over the property regardless of what the trust says," Walter didn't argue with him in the moment. He simply opened his own folder, slid a single page across the table, and said, "I'd be careful making that claim, Thomas. I've already had this document examined." The room went very quiet. My father tried, for a moment, to hold the line, insisting the signature was genuine, that Eleanor had been having a good day, that the timeline was being misrepresented. But Walter had brought the hospital's sedation log, time-stamped, alongside the forensic handwriting analysis, and laid them both on the table without raising his voice. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when someone realizes, in real time, in front of their family, that the thing they were counting on has just become evidence against them instead. Daniel didn't say much. He looked, more than anything, confused, the specific confusion of someone watching a certainty they'd never examined crumble in front of them in under 10 minutes. My mother put her face in her hands. I sat in the thinking chair, the one Eleanor used to make me sit in when I was small and needed to work something out, and felt the strange, quiet vertigo of being proven right about something I had never let myself fully believe. Walter closed both folders calmly. "The trust stands," he said. "The power of attorney is void. It was executed under conditions that don't meet the legal standard for capacity. And frankly, Thomas, your fortunate Eleanor's estate isn't pursuing this further than invalidating the document itself. I'd encourage you to be grateful for that, and to leave it there." We didn't leave it there, not all the way, not that day. The real confrontation happened 40 minutes later, in the parking lot outside Walter's office, after the formal meeting had ended, and the four of us stood in the kind of charged, unfinished silence that follows news too big to process indoors. Daniel found his voice first. "You knew about this," he said to me, not quite yelling, but close. "The whole time, all those Saturdays at the bakery, all that time in the orchard, you knew this was the plan." "I didn't know anything, Daniel," I said, and I meant it. "I didn't know there was a trust. I didn't know about the power of attorney. I found out everything in that room the same way you did." "But you let it happen. You let her." He stopped, visibly searching for a word that wouldn't sound as ugly as the one he was thinking. "You let her cut me out." "I didn't let her do anything," I said. "She made a choice, about her own property, based on 30 years of who showed up and who didn't." It wasn't kind, the way I said it, and I'm not going to pretend it was. I'd spent my whole life being gentle about this exact subject, softening every edge of every conversation about belonging so that no one else would have to feel the discomfort I'd been carrying since I was 8 years old. I didn't soften it that day. My father tried a different angle, quieter, more wounded. "We raised you the same as him, Marin. Exactly the same. I don't understand how you can stand there and let a piece of paper say otherwise." "I'm not the one who tried to forge a signature on a hospitalized woman, Dad," I said. "I'm not the one who needs a piece of paper to feel like family. I never had the luxury of not needing one." My mother didn't say anything for a long time. She stood slightly apart from my father and Daniel, arms wrapped around herself despite the June warmth, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't a defense. "I should have stopped your father when he started those conversations," she said quietly. "I told myself it was just paperwork. I think some part of me knew it wasn't, and I let it happen anyway because some part of me has spent 30 years assuming Daniel's claim to that place was just obvious, automatic, and I never once asked myself why I assumed that about him and never about you." It wasn't an apology, not fully. But it was the first time in my life my mother had said the quiet thing out loud instead of correcting it only after I'd already felt it. Daniel didn't have a version of that moment that day. He got in his car and left without another word, and I didn't see him again for almost 8 months. The legal aftermath was quieter than the parking lot had been. Eleanor's estate, through Walter, formally invalidated the power of attorney and referred the forged signature to the relevant state authority, but declined to pursue a criminal complaint against my father, a decision Walter told me was explicitly Eleanor's, made before her stroke even, in a margin note on an earlier draft of the trust. "If anyone in this family does something foolish, fix it. Don't ruin them over it." I'd rather they learn than be punished. Whether my father deserved that mercy is a question I've made peace with not having a clean answer to. The notary lost his commission. My father lost something less official, but I think more lasting, the unspoken authority he'd always carried in our family as the one who managed things, who handled paperwork, who could be trusted with the practical machinery of other people's trust. He never fully got that back, and I don't think he expected to. I took over Linden Road that autumn. The bakery first, then the orchard the following spring, once I understood the harvest cycle well enough to run it without Eleanor walking the rows beside me for the first time in 15 years. I kept the lemon scones. I kept the irrigation schedule she'd taught me, the one she swore by despite 3 different agricultural extension agents telling her it was outdated. I changed almost nothing that first year, because I didn't yet trust myself to know which parts of what she'd built were tradition and which were just habit, and I wanted time to learn the difference before I touched anything. My relationship with my mother slowly, imperfectly repaired itself over the following 2 years, not into something untroubled, but into something honest, which I've come to believe is more durable. We talk every week now. She comes to the bakery on Sundays and sits in the chair by the window where Eleanor used to sit, and neither of us has ever said out loud that this is what we're doing, but we both know it is. My father and I are polite. We see each other at holidays, exchange careful conversation, and have never once discussed the parking lot or the forged signature directly. I don't know if we ever will. I've stopped needing him to apologize in a particular way in order to move forward, which took longer than I'd like to admit. Daniel came back into the family slowly, on his own terms, almost a year after the will reading. He didn't apologize for the things he'd said in the parking lot, not in so many words, but he started showing up, first to a Sunday dinner, then to my daughter's first birthday 2 years later, then, eventually, to the bakery itself on an ordinary Tuesday, where he stood awkwardly by the register until I handed him an apron and told him row 6 needed thinning if he wanted something to do with his hands while we talked. We're not what we were before any of this. I don't think we ever will be, and I've stopped grieving that as much as I used to. But he comes by every few months now, and last spring he asked me, without any of the old entitlement in his voice, if I'd teach his daughter how to fold dough sometime, the way Eleanor taught me. I said yes, before he'd finished the sentence. People ask me sometimes, customers who have heard some version of this story secondhand, friends who have read about the case in the local paper's small business section, whether I feel vindicated. Whether winning the orchard felt the way I'd always imagined justice would feel, back when I was 8 years old and learning, for the first time, that some belonging in this family came with conditions and some didn't. The honest answer is that it didn't feel like winning at all. It felt like being seen, finally, by the one person who had been quietly building the case for it my entire life, one Saturday morning at a time, one patient lesson in dough and soil and irrigation lines at a time, without ever once telling me what she was doing or why it would matter. Eleanor Calloway never told me, in so many words, that I belonged to this family exactly as much as anyone born into it. She didn't need to. She spent 15 years proving it instead, in the only language she fully trusted, which was attention, consistency, and showing up. A trust document was just the part of that proof that happened to be written down. I think about her every morning I unlock the bakery door, in the particular quiet before the ovens warm up, when the orchard outside the back window is still dark and the whole place smells faintly of yesterday's flour. I think about the chair by the window and the manila envelope on her lap in the car that day, and the sentence she almost finished before her stroke took the rest of it from her. I know now what she was going to say. I didn't need her to finish the sentence after all. She'd already spent half my childhood saying it, one Saturday at a time, in the only way that ever really counts. This has been Marin's story. If it reminded you of someone, a grandmother who saw you clearly, a family that needed a piece of paper to catch up to something you already knew was true, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And if you believe legacy should follow care instead of blood, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.